As everyone takes their seats, I want to reiterate the point Angie made on the last panel when we had, the former chief planner of Boston kind of going back and forth with a planner who specializes in secondary cities in sub-Saharan Africa. That's quite literally exactly the diverse range of views that we really wanted. At this conference, we wanted a bunch of people from various backgrounds in one room, exchanging views and having an open dialogue, and I'm really happy that that's happening. I'm also happy, I had no clue some of you were going to be here, like Teresa. I didn't know you were Corazon, I didn't know you were going to be here, and it looks like she's not anymore, so. Who else is here? I mean, my friends from New York, Michael's here, Patrick, Kobe, so I'm very happy about the way today's turned out. For those who don't know, I'm Kurtis Lockhart. I'm the Executive Director of the Charter Cities Institute. As I said, we wanted the aim of this thing to be an open dialogue on these new city developments and on charter cities in the global south as a response to really rapid urbanization. We thought, given that aim, that it'd be good for somebody to get up and make a sort of case for charter cities and maybe address some pretty common critiques that we've heard from them. So I'm going to do just that. So this talk might be a little more conceptual and high level than some of the ones especially the practitioner session we just heard. So it's going to be about 30 minutes. This is the agenda. I'm going to start with the why. Why are these important? I then want to talk about definitions, then move on to critiques, and then I'll talk very briefly at the end about CCI's work and our sort of high-level vision, that sort of thing. Okay, so to start with the why, I sort of break this down into two key rationales. One is a political economy rationale, and the other is a much more pragmatic rationale. So just first on the political economy rationale, so this is the basic takeaway from institutional economics literature, right? It's that institutions are a key determinant of sustained economic growth. And this is also a sort of core premise that the argument for charter cities rests on, is that institutions are important. And we're talking about institutions, I know people come from varying backgrounds, we're talking about institutions in this Douglas North sense of institutions as the rules of the game in a society, right? So the laws, the policies, the underlying social norms of a society, and that's how we're defining them. So just briefly, right, the implication of the institutional economics literature then is to say that these poor regions on the bottom, in order to get closer to these richer regions on top, they have to go through they have to undergo some sort of institutional change. And the challenge here is that institutional change, it turns out, is actually really, really hard. The economist Mansur Olson, I think, is best on this point. Olson's sort of fundamental insight is that there are both winners and losers to institutional reform. So if you think about institutional reform in low-income countries, the potential loser of proposed reforms is often this small group of incumbent political elites that currently gain from the status quo institutions, right? And because they're currently gaining from these institutions, they want to resist and block reforms. And so what ends up happening is the result is bad institutions persist, and you get these, South Asia's and Sub-Saharan Africa's of the world kind of trapped in this suboptimal political equilibrium. So Charter Cities sort of recognizes this political economy problem, and it says, okay, there's this web of entrenched interests at the top, at the national level, when we try and approach institutional reform from out there. So instead of the national level, let's try a second best option by localizing reforms down in this kind of concentrated, delimited chunk of land, ideally in a sparsely populated area. Why greenfield land? Because we think then its reforms are less likely to bump up against the interests of incumbent political elites, and as a result, these elites are less likely to organize for pushing back on those institutional reforms, and therefore in that concentrated space, you're likely able to get much deeper institutional reforms passed than otherwise possible at the national level. So this is, in essence, saying charter cities are this sort of mechanism that allow institutional change when institutional change is really hard. Okay, the second rationale is so much more straightforward, much more pragmatic, and this is kind of talked about during the morning sessions. It's just that there are hundreds of new city developments, some estimates thousands of new city developments across the globe today. This is in response to huge demand for urban spaces. Patrick already covered this, but this graph is, as you can see, we're entering this new urban age of human history, and it's going to be a very different world than all past centuries. So 95% of the 2.5 billion people-ish that are going to become new city residents over the next 30-ish years are going to be concentrated in the global south, right? In low-income, lower middle-income cities that often lack the legal powers, the financial resources, the technical capacity to deal with that influx of people and that urban growth. And so this is all to say that today we have these, this says 200, estimates vary depending on how you define these things. We have hundreds of new city developments being constructed, planned across more than 40 countries. This construction is happening with or without researchers, right? It's going forward. Billions and billions are being invested. And so it's my contention is that these projects and their outcomes can be made better if there are many more researchers looking into this question, like Suchi, like Martin, and others, empirically, objectively, and with data. And that's the main point of this slide, is given these projects are being built, I think some more efforts at evidence-based prescription is really merited in this space. Okay, so turning to definitions, just kind of very high level, what's a charter city? A charter city broadly is a new city with new rules. Within this definition, there have been a few different models proposed. So let's first chat about the man, unfortunately not in the room today, Paul Romer. So he gave this now pretty famous TED Talk back in 2009, coining the term charter cities. And he proposed this as a response, what he thought was a feasible response to these two really big challenges that we just spoke about: really rapid urbanization in really poor places, and poor institutions in those places. And he says, how can we move the needle on these two really, really big problems? And he came up with this foreign guarantor model. In a nutshell, it is where a low-income, poorly governed country like Honduras basically cedes a city-scale sized chunk of land to a high-income, well-governed country like Canada. Canada then comes in, basically in effect imports its good institutions, right, good governance into this delimited chunk of land, and then businesses are crowded into this chunk of land, and this kickstarts sustained economic growth. This is the very bare bones, basic logic. So I'm not gonna rehash the whole history. Suffice it to say, there was criticism. I'm sure a lot of you are aware that this sounds pretty weird and pretty kooky. The main criticism is that this model, some thought, infringes on the sovereignty of the host country. And it's on this point, it's on this sovereignty point, that we think the model that we're looking at, which is public-private partnerships that have been talked about throughout this especially the sessions in the morning, is a much more viable alternative to these problems of urbanization and poor institutions. Okay, so instead of this this foreign guarantor model, what we kind of want is this, as I said, public-private partnership between the host country on the one hand and the urban developer on the other. And I'll go through this quickly because again, we talked about this a bit in the morning sessions, but basically two main elements here. First is land, right? The agreement, public-private partnership agreement carves out this special jurisdiction, ideally on greenfield land, right? I mentioned earlier that this means the city can largely avoid or circumvent the entrenched interests of the political elites that block reform at the national level, right? The second element is decentralized governance. And this one can really be broken down into two key components. One is the establishment of a city administration that's distinct from the host country, so sort of like the executive branch of the city or the bureaucracy of the city. And then the second on the legislative side is the charter city as a city council, a council that's sort of empowered to make its own laws and pass its own regulations. This model isn't kind of made up out of nowhere. It comes from the council manager form of local governance here in the US. It's actually the most common form of local governance across America, and it's very common across the globe as well. Okay, so just summing up some of the, I think, pluses of this model over the foreign guarantor model. I think the first point is probably the most important. As I said, we think that you can get all of the benefits of deep institutional reforms without infringing on sovereignty, and that's important. Second, we think this aligns incentives really well, right? For the host country, the host country should be given a financial stake in the success of the charter city. That way they're less likely to, at some point down the line, jeopardize or in any way interfere with that city. And from the developer standpoint, right, their incentives are in a way aligned because they want to maximize profits. They do this by increasing land values. How do you do that? By attracting more firms and people to the city and serving them well. Positive sum was mentioned again this morning. And then a really important fourth point here is on policy experimentation. So this allows sort of on this small scale to test different policies, and you can find out which ones are successful at that level, which ones aren't, and then scale up from there. And this is one of the reasons we think China was really successful post-1978. Okay, so shifting to some common critiques. So I'm going to address these three critiques of this sort of model in turn. One is on this kind of labeling of charter cities as kind of technocratic or private governance. I think this label in the initial stages of the city development is actually pretty fair, right? There will be a lot of private sector involvement. I think it gets less fair increasingly as time goes on, and we'll go over that a little later. So I tend to prefer thinking of this as a blended form of governance, again, as was alluded to this morning. So I think of this as a shared, sort of genuinely as a shared co-development strategy between both the host country and the investors, right, these partners. They're both invested, they both bring something to the table to make long-run urban development happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. So I'm going to talk about these three facets in particular. So the PPP model, the private sector is able to fill these capacity gaps. I'm going to talk about some precedents and then some safeguards. Okay, so I think it's important to delineate how today's wave of urbanization is kind of very different from past waves of urbanization. In particular, in sub-Saharan Africa, places that we've heard about today from Patrick and from Kobe and Green, incomes per capita are significantly lower in this period of urbanization that they're undergoing than past countries. And so if we look, for example, at the US hit 50% urbanized in about 1920. At that point, it had per capita incomes of $7,500 per person. If we fast forward to the 70s, it had per capita incomes of around $4,500 per person. If you look at, for example, the DRC today, DRC's per capita incomes, it's at 46% urbanized. It's careening towards 50% very fast. They have per capita incomes of $550 per person. And so what I think this gets at is that while city governments in the US during periods of its rapid urbanization, they had access to this tax base in order to finance urban infrastructure. That tax base isn't necessarily present in a lot of African and low-income countries today. And that's a problem, and I think that means that the way urbanization is unfolding needs to be rethought and reimagined, and that likely also means, given the low tax bases, there's going to be a more important role for the private sector to play. Okay, so next I want to show that this PPP model has some precedents and actually some pretty run-of-the-mill precedents. We see these arrangements pretty much everywhere, including being very ubiquitous here in the US. 74 million Americans are living today in either homeowners associations, in condominiums, or in housing cooperatives. Right? This is 53% of all US homeowners in some kind of HOA. And these HOAs are some form of private or public-private governance. And so this is, again, analogous to this PPP model that I and others have spoke about today. Another thing that's so informative about this HOA model is it has this established procedure for a way to transition from a developer-led HOA towards, later on, an HOA controlled more by its residents over time, right? The new residents of this new community. Without getting too deep into the weeds, the sort of rule of thumb is that at the beginning, when there are few residents or no residents, the developer has all of the seats on the HOA board, so it controls the governing body of the community. Gradually, as new residents move in, more seats on the HOA board are transitioned over, reallocated over to these new residents. And the rule is that by the time 75% of the units within the HOA are sold to residents, then that HOA board all the seats on that board are entirely reallocated towards residents. So I think of this as a source of inspiration for how to model a way to transition over from sort of developer-led governance to a governance that has or allows for more democratic voice. on this point of sort of this transition to more democratic voice, so I think there's a time we need to worry about this too, right? In the first generation, if we're assuming these cities are either full greenfield, quasi-greenfield, this first generation of residents have voluntarily chosen to move to this city. Therefore, in a way, they've voted with their feet. So I think it's really during this second generation, right, the children of the first generation, it's when they come of age, they never chose to be there. And so it's at this time when we really need to think about transitioning in some way, perhaps inspired by this HOA model I just went over. Okay, and then on the safeguards point, so there's no reason why this developer should be unchecked. There are accountability mechanisms to put in place that can make sure that their incentives are better aligned with public interest and the public good over time. I put two here, there are many more. So one is this third-party audit where the performance of the developer is assessed and then made publicly available. Second is this referendum. There's no reason why these two can't work in tandem as well. So you can imagine, for example, if you had a rule where, say, 3 negative audits in a row occurred, that could trigger or bring forward a referendum, right? And so you can experiment with this, and there are several more safeguards that could be applied. Okay, so another risk I wanted to cover is around expropriation, right? One of the critiques is, okay, how can you be sure once the charter city becomes a success that the host government won't come in and sort of kill the goose that laid the golden egg, so to speak, come in and expropriate or seize assets. On this point, there are a few ways to mitigate this risk. One we already talked about, right? So a financial stake in the city, a host country then therefore is less likely to come in retroactively and seize assets because it would be jeopardizing its own future stream of financial resources. Secondly is, a second way to lessen risk is via these international investment treaties, right? One of the more common ones is this New York Convention. The convention basically says that in the event of expropriation, the affected party, right, in this case the developer, has recourse to compensation. And sometimes, when you're trying to collect that compensation from a sovereign, it takes a very long time. So there are these political risk insurance products that you can get to expedite the collection of that compensation. And then the fourth one here, we have some world bankers in the audience, so we can chat about this after maybe, is something like a neutral, reputable party on the council. I chose the World Bank just because they are neutral, they are reputable, but they also give concessional loans to most low and middle income countries across the globe, and these countries therefore would not want to jeopardize access to those concessional loans with the bank, and therefore they'd be less likely, if the bank is involved in these projects, to want to interfere or jeopardize. So again, these are tools you can use to lessen the likelihood of expropriation, but because in our model, these charter cities are not sovereign, right? They're subject to the Constitution, the criminal law, the international treaties of the host country. You cannot eliminate this risk fully. Okay, so last I want to talk about a critique that's commonly leveled at charter cities is that they'll end up being these elite enclaves or gated communities. This was alluded to a bit earlier today. I think while some of these new city developments can definitely have these characteristics, obviously are resort towns, they're gated communities, etc. I think the exact opposite can occur too. I think that these charter cities can be mechanisms for empowerment and enrichment of marginalized or indigenous groups. And I'm going to go over an example of just this. I want to talk about the Squamish Nation in Vancouver. I'm a Vancouverite, so I love this example. So a little backstory, the Squamish Nation, they were deported from this downtown Vancouver land in 1913. Fast forward 100 years, about 100 years, and they won this landmark court case in 2002 that gave them some of their old downtown land back. And when First Nations group gets land, right, that comes with a lot of autonomy attached to it, at least in Canada. I think the reserves here in the States have the same arrangements. And so, the question then becomes, what did the Squamish Nation want to do with this land? And what they chose is to enter into a partnership with a developer, Westbank, and build the largest First Nation-led housing project in Canadian history. This partnership is a 50-50 partnership with Westbank, this developer. The estimates suggest that over the lifetime of the buildings, the rental income it'll generate towards just Squamish Nation is between 8 and 10 billion. So if this pans out, that would be, I would wager, probably one of the most transformational Indigenous empowerment programs in Canadian history. So they want to, the plan is to build 6,000 apartments, an estimated 10,000 people on less than 5 hectares of land. So we're talking, almost Hong Kong level densities. And the kind of great added bonus is that these can be built really, really quickly, because again, with First Nations land, they have some autonomy. They're not subject to this web of zoning and land use regulations. And so this can be a really, really expedited build, which is also nice. It's nice because Vancouver has a housing affordability crisis, so if everyone will move back, here we go. And then this project was also put to a vote among the members of the Squamish Nation, and they voted in favor of the project to the tune of almost 90%. So, right, the city of Vancouver wins, the developer wins, the people of Vancouver win, right, housing shortage and more housing is great for that, and of course the Squamish Nation wins. So, again, far from always exacerbating inequality, they can actually be quite powerful mechanisms for just the opposite. Okay, so I wanted to end here on a brief note on CCI's work. So we're working on several new city projects and several research projects. Mainly they're focused in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the most rapidly urbanizing region on planet Earth. One of our more advanced projects is in Malawi, so I'll talk a bit about that and much less about the others, and then I'll close. So the Malawi project. We are an implementation partner for Malawi's secondary cities plan that Kobe and Green talked about earlier today. That work comes in basically 2 tracks. One is this kind of legal urban governance track, where we have a legal expert who's here, Michael, embedded with the Ministry of Justice in Malawi. And he's working on helping co-draft a special economic zone bill with the Ministry of Justice. Under this bill, there'll be this special designation that can be applied to these 8 secondary cities that devolves a lot more authorities down to these cities than is the sort of status quo for local authorities in Malawi. The second track is on the more physical built environment. So that track is kind of proactive urban planning in the style that Patrick talked about today. And the next step there is a sort of design charrette, an urban planning charrette, I believe to happen early in 2023 from last conversations. The work in Zambia is much earlier stages, but the approval is to pilot 3 charter city projects across the country, and then similar tracks of work in Kenya soon with their secondary cities plan as well. And then just, I wanted to close on one last point, this kind of calling all researchers point. I think it's relevant to, we have students here, we have researchers, we have some practitioners. There are, a lot, as we saw today, a lot of important questions that we don't have really objective or empirical answers to yet on these projects. We, CCI, we are a small team. There's like no way possible that we can answer all of these open questions on our own. We have these projects to be analyzed. We ideally want to embed monitoring and evaluation teams within these projects, ideally from the very start. And the hope is that ultimately, each new city project has its own implementation team that can rigorously estimate impacts. It can knowledge share with the other new cities. It can disseminate best practices across these new city teams. And by doing this, we think we can create these much more rapid feedback loops between these cities that really spur learning in a very similar extent to CFLD and their database of 1 million firms and using that to improve across their cities. I think this would greatly increase the likelihood that this rapid urbanization process, especially as it happens through new city developments, is better managed. And I think that would be a positive sum result for everyone. So that's it. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming.